Let's talk a little bit about the computer you're using. Now, I realize you already have a machine, and I am sure that's perfectly fine and will be fine throughout this training. But if you are at any point thinking about upgrading, then I want to share a few thoughts about hardware and operating system and so on. Now, your primary requirements may not be driven by Fusion. It's entirely possible and valid that you think about color grading or editing, or even have other applications that you are predominantly using and that drive your requirements. If you are thinking a lot about Fusion, then here are a few thoughts I would like to share. Let's talk about the operating system. I have been personally using Linux in the past a lot, recently more Windows. I might go back to Linux. I don't have any experience with Mac, not to say anything against this. The point is, all these three operating systems are well supported for quite some time by Blackmagic Design. So all of these three systems are used in professional environments with Resolve and with Fusion Studio. So all of these systems are fine. Of course, if you ask on Facebook or so, everyone will have an opinion what is best and what gives you the most performance and so on. I haven't seen any real hard evidence that one system is superior over the other in any meaningful way. Now, I have seen some tests where they compared Windows versus Linux and so on. And of course, Linux is the system that is widely used on high-performance computing systems. Like if you think about cluster computers, if you have some crazy Resolve system with 8 GPUs or stuff like that, then Linux may be the way to go. For a desktop or workstation set up for a single user, I haven't seen any clear evidence that one is really superior compared to the other. There is, of course, difference in usage. Linux is very prominent in VFX facilities because of the high performance aspect and because it's very friendly for programmers. So if you are working on your own scripting stuff and use the command line a lot and do certain batch processing stuff and so on, there's a lot in Linux that is really helpful for technically minded people who are working on that level. If you are a, let's say, less technically minded user and you're just an end user of Resolve or Fusion, then that aspect is probably not so important, and Mac or Windows may be more comfortable for you. Also, Linux doesn't support all applications. For example, most of the Adobe stuff is not available for Linux. When it comes to Mac and Windows, I think both of these are good choices. I can't really talk much about Mac, but I guess the main difference here is when you are going for Mac, you are going for a system where Apple has mostly decided on the hardware configurations, whereas when you go for Windows, you can build your own, you can take whatever hardware you want. Also, when it comes to upgrading, and that's the point where I stick to Windows and Linux, I have at the moment under my desk an HP Z840, not the most recent and most fancy one, but it's just a big box, and if I want to, I can throw in more RAM, I can throw in more hard drives, and there's really space in there, and there are really options for me to put in what I want to put in. And with the Mac, already the form factor of the Mac desktop PC has some limitations. And of course, if you have a laptop or so, then this may not really be such a big concern. All in all, with Windows, your choice of hardware is of course wider, so both the cheaper systems and the more expensive ones. If you really look into the high-end systems, for example, from HP or the Dell Precision series, you can get some high-end configurations which are far above of what you can get for Mac. That being said, if Mac fits into your budget and if that's what you like using, go for it. When it comes to specific hardware selection and system configurations, I don't really want to recommend any specific brands or specific components. First of all, it would be outdated in 2-3 months, and second of all, I am not the expert on this, but there are experts who are testing this stuff and who are giving some recommendations. My first look would be the hardware and configuration guide that Blackmagic Design publishes. So they publish some recommendations how to set up a DaVinci Resolve system and what kind of hardware they recommend. There are also multiple vendors who sell pre-packaged complete Resolve solutions and give recommendations what kind of hardware you should use. Typically they look mostly at color grading, but nowadays there are also some recommendations regarding Fusion. So if you want to look at specific systems, even if you want to build it yourself, you might just want to have a look what they are currently offering and what they put together, and then you can decide if that's something for you or if you want to build something on your own. So I think that's always worth a look. And I have actually seen vendors doing actual tests and publishing test results with different hardware, different number of GPUs and so on, mostly for color grading at the moment. But I think if Fusion gets more track, so I hope to see some more evaluations from a Fusion perspective as well. Coming to individual components, I just want to give some general high-level guidelines, and then you can see what components fit your budget and what is currently available. So first, let's talk about GPU and CPU. Whenever you look for Resolve recommendations, people in forums and so on first ask what GPU do you have, right? And first talk about GPUs. And the reason is really the color grading part of DaVinci Resolve. And there is a difference where Resolve and where Fusion come from. Resolve was always extremely GPU oriented, and the reason is the GPU has limited memory compared to the access of the CPU, which accesses the whole RAM memory of the PC. The GPU has smaller memory, but if your frame fits into that memory, then the GPU can do parallel processing in a really efficient way on that memory that it holds. Right? The downside is whatever is loaded into the GPU comes through the CPU, right? So you have the PCI Express lanes, the technical term from the CPU, which are connected to the GPU. So this can be the bottleneck. And this is the reason why compositing traditionally hasn't done much with GPUs. Because in compositing, you can no longer say, okay, I'm working on an HD project, or I'm working on a 4K or 6K project or whatever. Because you can have different sources which you are compositing together, right? You can have multiple streams, you can have multipath renderers from 3D applications and so on. You can have multiple masks, etc. Now, some of this may be relevant for grading as well, but really the compositing aspect itself means that you can't really say, okay, I have this frame size and I'm only working on this. So this is the reason why compositing was mostly done on CPU, where you have access to the full RAM memory, and then whatever flow you build is being processed by the CPU. Now, recently there have been a lot of GPU accelerations being introduced by Blackmagic Design into Fusion and into Fusion in Resolve. And I think the main motivation is probably because people have powerful GPUs nowadays, and especially in Resolve systems, from editing, from color grading and so on, it's good to use the GPU also for Fusion, right? But so far what I have seen is that individual tools are being accelerated. So for an individual tool, again, you have a certain frame size which goes in, and then this individual Fusion tool is being accelerated to perform better with the GPU. You had this already before from the renderer node, where you have the OpenGL renderer, which uses the GPU, but then again, you also have the software renderer, which uses the CPU. Now, bottom line, CPU and GPU are important for Fusion, but from its background and for certain fundamental reasons, the CPU will always be very important, and the GPU may do some accelerations. And depending on your flow and your setup, it's possible that not the GPU, but the CPU may be your limiting factor. Coming to the parallelization, there is CPU parallelization being used. So if you have a flow which is branched, it's possible to have parallel branching. There's a setting also in the menu where this can be enabled. And this can determine that Fusion or Resolve can do calculations in parallel on the CPU. Also, individual frames can be rendered in parallel on Fusion Studio. So if you use the render manager in Fusion Studio, you can even distribute via multiple machines, or have multiple frames calculated in parallel on the same machine during the renderer. And this is again a CPU parallelization. Now coming to RAM, this is important for caching in the Fusion page or in Fusion Studio. So basically when you play back your timeline of your Fusion composition, the cache is being filled, and you see the green progress bar where individual nodes are being cached, and it will be filled until your RAM is full, and then frames are being dropped out from the other end while you're playing back. So more RAM means more tools can be cached and longer segments in the timeline can be cached, and you have a more interactive experience at the end. If you have low RAM, then you may not be able to cache an entire shot at once, and your cache is being rebuilt and you don't have interactive rendering. That's the main point about RAM. So the more you can put in there, the more you have available in the Fusion cache. For hard disks, only one comment. Now Fusion has here the least requirements. If you're editing, if you're editing a documentary or something, you have to think about where to put all that massive storage. For Resolve in general, also for editing, you want to have a scratch disk where optimized media can be stored, or where color grades or Fusion edits can be cached to disk. Now, purely from a Fusion perspective, what I think is very useful is if you have something as fast as possible or as fast as affordable, which you can use for the few frames where you're really intensively working on. Now, if you are working, you're not doing highly advanced VFX compositing for 2 hours. And if you're doing it, you're not doing it in one go, right? You are working on shots at a time. And if you're working on a detailed shot for half a day or 1 day or 2 days, you may want to render out stuff in between, or you may want to work on it step by step, create maybe some EXR files of part of your solution and then load them in, put them together, and so on. And then it can be really helpful to have some very fast disk for that portion where you can put the media and the temporary results and so on that you may be using, and have fast access to it. So for me, I have some PCI Express storage for that purpose, and even if it's just 1 terabyte or 500 gigabyte or even less, it can help. That being said, if you also do editing or color grading, that will probably determine your main requirements for hard drives. Coming to monitors, I use a 2-monitor setup, which is very nice. And on one monitor I have my full Fusion page, and on the second one I might have either a full screen output, which you can have via a decklink card in DaVinci Resolve, or since version 16.1 it should now also be possible without a dedicated monitor card, which was previously required. So I think for people who don't need a color reference display, having just a full screen output is great to have. If I'm using Fusion Studio, it's also possible to configure it that way, both with and without a decklink card or video output card. However, what I typically do with Fusion Studio is I just use it on one screen, and then when I need to, or if I want to see it bigger, I take a floating viewer onto that second monitor. That's not technically a full screen view, but it is large enough for me, and it has all the viewer controls as well. So if I want to do some rotoscoping or so, for example, I can do it on the second monitor on a large view. And if I don't need it, I can minimize it, and I can have, for example, my file explorer or even other software, maybe Photoshop or something like that. If I need to switch back and forth, I can have it on my second monitor, or I can look at some references on my second monitor of some other images or something that I need to see. So this way I have my setup a bit more flexible, I feel. So that's my preference, and one reason why I enjoy working on Fusion Studio, because it has this flexibility with the floating viewer, which you don't have in DaVinci Resolve. Okay, so much for my thoughts about hardware. I hope this gave you a little bit of, general background. I know once it comes to buying new equipment and so on, it's always a lot of research and a big headache, at least for me. But for this course, I'm not trying to push computing boundaries in a training course. So whatever you have been successfully using until this point will hopefully be entirely fine throughout this course.